Good afternoon. Welcome to the Fairfield University Alumni Career Services webinar series. My name is Julie Tizzoli, class of 1985, and I'm the Director of Alumni Career Services. Our webinar today is Performance Coaching, How to Improve Retention, Teamwork, and Productivity. Today's webinar has been very well received by our alumni community with 85 registrants. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. This webinar is being recorded and will be found in its entirety at www.fairfield.edu/alumni-career within 3 to 5 business days. If you experience any technical difficulties, please call Alumni Relations immediately at 203-254-4280 so we can try to help you. You can also send a message to me in the chat box if you are experiencing any difficulties. Questions are welcome and encouraged throughout the presentation. We will have plenty of time at the end to answer them. Please input your questions in the question box. The box is located in the control bar and will show up when you click on the GoToWebinar View menu in the upper right-hand corner. I would now like to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Paul Maloney. Paul, if you want to put up your slides, we can get started. Great. Paul serves as Assistant Professor of the Practice and Applied Psychology program at Fairfield University Graduate School of Education and Allied Professions. He teaches organizational psychology, organizational development, consulting skills, and designing training and development programs. His career includes senior management and development positions at NBC, Mobil Oil Corporation, and PepsiCo International, and he has consulted worldwide for American Airlines, Covidien, GE, Kodak, Gartner, and many other organizations. His specialties include change management, communications, executive feedback and coaching, and presentation skills. He received a bachelor's degree from Holy Cross and a doctorate from the University of Virginia. Everybody, please welcome Dr. Paul Maloney. Paul?
Thank you very much, Julie. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to work with you this afternoon on performance coaching. Now, as we proceed in our webinar, we're going to be focusing upon 4 key areas. First one is doing a situational analysis. And any time that we have a performance issue or want to do performance coaching, it's a good idea to do an analysis of what are the key issues involved. Secondly, we'll take a look at key coaching principles. What are some of the factors that have a great deal of influence upon the results of coaching and the impact of coaching? And then thirdly, coaching communication techniques. We find that people respond in many different ways to being asked about coaching. And how do we deal with some of these coaching situations, for example, such as improving employee performance. Lastly, we're going to introduce you to what we call the ABLE coaching model. And ABLE stands for assessment, building a plan, launching the plan, and evaluating the plan. A 4-step process for coaching. So let's get started. Coaching results. As we look at coaching, for example, we have found over the years that, based upon the research, that coaching has had a significant impact upon goal setting, for example, with employees. It helps to get higher levels of commitment, for example, from an employee. It also has been effective in developing working relationships and breaking down the barriers that oftentimes exist between an employee and a manager or peers, for example. We found also that it can improve teamwork, and what it does is help develop a sense of cohesion within the team. And certainly it has had a significant impact upon job satisfaction and retention. And we're going to take a look at that issue of retention in just a moment. It's reduced absenteeism anywhere from 15 to 20%. And on productivity, we've seen increases that have ranged from a low of 10% to as much as 35 and 40%.
Hi, Paul.
Excuse me,
I'm going to interrupt you a second. If
yep.
Your slides are not going forward, so we're just seeing the title slide.
You're just seeing the title slide?
Yes. Excuse us, everybody, while we fix this. There you go.
Huh. I don't know
now
why that happened.
Why employees leave?
Yes. Well, no, I was on the previous slide, but I'll move to this slide now. I don't know why that happened. Thank you, Julie.
Okay.
Okay, talking about retention, one of the reasons why employees have a tendency to leave an organization, and the primary reason that we have found, is the supervisor's style. So supervisors have a very significant impact upon individuals' performance. And as a result, if they don't get along with their supervisor, they don't like the style, for example, such as micromanaging, they end up leaving the organization. Second reason is mismatches. We have mismatches between the job and the worker. Perhaps the individual doesn't fit the culture, for example, of the organization. But in addition to that, there's oftentimes a misunderstanding as to why the person was selected in the first place. There's no coaching or feedback. And this has been a very critical issue for a number of years now, because many people don't get feedback on their performance, and they don't get coaching. We've seen, for example, the results coming out of the Gallup survey. And in the Gallup survey, as many as 60% of the people who have responded to the Gallup survey have indicated that they receive no coaching or feedback and very little interest on the part of their managers or supervisors to develop them and provide advancement opportunities. So as a result, they do feel devalued and unrecognized. So coaching is a very critical skill, to say the least. Okay, moving on to the next page here, we look at situational analysis. Now, Julie sent out the case study, and on the case study, we asked 3 questions. What are the performance problems? What are the consequences? And what are the causes? Now, as we review the case study and we identify the performance problems, we can see, for example, that this person, Lee Ward, has been simply a satisfactory performer and simply meets the basic requirements of the job and has been doing that for some period of time. Now, that's not a performance problem necessarily. However, if we look at the fact that the department was reorganized and Lee's job's responsibilities did not change, we see that maybe one of the issues that comes out here is, has there been a discussion with Lee regarding job responsibilities? We find also further down, Lee has been reluctant to share information. In addition, in paragraph 3, we find that there were 3 incomplete and late reports, and each report was 3 days late to the supervisor. Now here we have some facts, and this is factual information obviously because the supervisor has that information in hand and has made the observations on that. As we move, however, to paragraph 4, we find that Lee has been identified as having an attitude, and phone calls are not returned, and the information is being withheld purposely. This is hearsay information at this point. It has not been confirmed. So we want to rely upon what we have in terms of the actual factual information and not upon hearsay. The hearsay needs to be confirmed, basically. We also find that Not only has Lee not performed, but in addition to that, Lee received a merit increase last week, as we saw in the first paragraph, indicating that the supervisor should have done something to hold up the merit increase and provided feedback specifically to Lee, and that does not seem to have occurred. So what are the consequences of this? Well, we see a number of consequences. Some embarrassment on Marty's part. We see some embarrassment as far as the department is concerned, and we see lower levels of productivity as a result. Now, at this stage, if we ask the question, what are the causes? Well, we could have a whole range of causes. For example, maybe there are obstacles that are getting in the way. Maybe Marty didn't tell Lee what his or her expectations were. Maybe Lee has a personal problem. Maybe there's a personality conflict. Maybe they simply didn't get feedback. We really don't know what the causes are at this point. Now, many times, for example, when we run into performance problems, the manager or supervisor is very quick to make a decision as to what the cause might be. And typically they go in to have that kind of a discussion without really thinking about, do I know what the causes are? At this point, we don't know what the causes are. We do know, however, that there hasn't been any feedback, for example, given to Lee at this point. So as we move along, we're going to discuss this case in a variety of ways, and we're going to take a look at how we ultimately give feedback to Lee. Anytime there is a gap between the current performance and the expected performance, there's a need for coaching. We refer to this basically as a gap analysis. So Lee is not measuring up to the performance that's expected of him or her. And we find that there is a gap between the two, between what they're performing and what the expected performance is. And so as a coach, we need to step into that gap and figure out what the problem is and also identify the causes and have that feedback discussion. So questions we need to ask ourselves as we're progressing in terms of our coaching is this important? Well, obviously in this case it is a very important problem because it's having a significant impact on productivity and performance, not only for that department but also for others. Secondly, has the job been defined? Well, there hasn't been any redefinition of the job as far as we know in terms of the reorganization. So we assume that the responsibilities are still the same as was indicated in the case. Has the person performed this act recently? Have they done it recently? Well, if they haven't, then we would need to give them some opportunity to practice it. Have they done it in the past? If they have performed it in the past, then we have some indication that they're able to do it. And if they are able from the past, they may just need the practice to get up to date again. And lastly, could they do it if their life depended upon it? And if we answer yes to that, then certainly it's not a feedback issue, it's a training issue. On the other hand, if we move forward, has Lee received feedback? And we know from the case study, Lee has not received any feedback regarding his or her performance. And so this tends to be the key issue that needs to be addressed. Doesn't say anything about there being any problem as far as resources or obstacles or a personal problem at this point. So we need to proceed with the feedback issue. And how do we handle the feedback? Well, in giving feedback, people respond in many different ways. And I'm going to ask you as a member of the audience to respond. What are people's reactions? And Julie will give us some idea as to what you have seen in terms of people's reactions to receiving feedback. Julie?
Okay, if anybody has any, wants to put any answers in as to how have people responded to feedback, what have been the reactions, please put that into your question box, and I will read it aloud. Okay, we have a few here. In a defensive manner, defensiveness seems to be the big one.
Mm-hmm.
People get defensive.
Right.
Fear, something is wrong. People
Fear.
get upset. Yeah, fear. Tears, anger, indifference. Those are all pretty good. Oh, surprise. Denial.
Surprise. Denial.
For people who are on top of things, they have their ducks in order with explanations.
Mm-hmm.
In the public sector, unionized environment, they grieve the feedback. Sometimes they shut down after negative feedback. Okay, I think that's good. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you. So one of the key things that comes out typically is, and one of the primary ones, is the defensive behavior, defensive reaction basically to feedback. And then it's demonstrated in a variety of different ways in terms of defensiveness, as fear, for example, or surprise, or anger, for example, or they deny it, or they try to displace it on someone else, for example. So what we want to do is to take a few minutes here and think about some of the ways that we can handle these kinds of situations. So we need to use our communication techniques. And among these, for example, would be such things as active listening, where we get involved and we really listen intently to how the person explains the situation to us. Certainly asking a lot of questions, both open and closed kinds of questions, to further the dialogue. Paraphrasing, empathizing, trying to understand it from their point of view, and of course, summarizing. Now, some of the things that we've found particularly useful as far as dealing with defensive behavior are open and closed questions. Now, for example, we might think in terms of an open question. Well, why did this happen, or how did this happen? Can you give me an explanation for this? Can you give me further details on how this occurred? Or we might paraphrase, for example, what their response is, repeating it back to them, encouraging them, therefore, to continue giving us further information. Another technique is to use silence. Ask the person a question and then wait for the response. And when they give you the response, you remain silent. And it indicates that you want them to continue speaking, or that you're dissatisfied with the kind of response, for example, that they may have given you. Another technique is to use role reversal. Encourage the person to think as if they were in your shoes. How would you feel, for example, if I did this to you? Or how would you feel if you did this happened to you, for example? Or simply using a neutral response such as a nod of the head. Oh, yes, mm-hmm, I understand, I see. Anything along those lines encourages them to give you further information. Now, the key on giving feedback, as we'll see, is being specific and concise. Now, we use a coaching cycle, for example. We assess and provide feedback, we build a plan, we launch, and we evaluate. However, one of the key things we need to look at before we go into the actual coaching is what kind of a style are we going to use? And styles can vary depending upon whom we're trying to influence. For example, we have 4 different styles listed out here: the driver style, counterpoint, prompter, and resonator. Now, the kind of style that we select is very much dependent upon what the situation requires. So, for example, we find oftentimes that with people who have not had a lot of experience, we may end up using a driver kind of style. And by a driver style, what is meant is that the supervisor or the coach tends to take the primary role in determining what needs to be done. In other words, they help to develop the plan for addressing the specific issue involved. So the individual carries out the solution. There tends to be, unfortunately, when you use a driver kind of style, very little learning that takes place. And oftentimes resistance will develop if that's the only style that a coach uses. A second style that a coach may employ is being objective and non-judging. In other words, being a counterpoint. And the individual has to decide what needs to be done and how it's to be done. What the coaching style of a counterpoint involves providing information and indicating that there is a disjunction between what the person says they will do and what they actually do. And so providing that information, they become the counterpoint, so to speak, to the individual, and it encourages them to take action. We also have a third style, which is called the prompter. And on the prompter style, we provide them, individual, with information regarding their performance, but it may come from checklists, it might come from some observations, it might come from 360 feedback, it might come from assessments. But the information that comes from these tools becomes the prompter and encourages the individual to want to take action to change the situation. And the last one is the resonator. And this tends to be a style that's particularly effective with more senior people in an organization, and primarily because it works on the assumption that the individual, in this case, simply needs to clarify their thinking. Now we find, for example, oftentimes in organizations, that particularly at the senior level, that people need someone that they can bounce ideas off, and that they can discuss issues with in a confidential manner, and this is where executive coaching becomes particularly important. And this particular style encourages an empathic understanding, try to see things from their frame of reference, and we realize that the individual has the inner resources to solve the problems. So we discuss and clarify as opposed to giving them a lot of direct direction on it. So in selecting a style, therefore, we look at the willingness of the individual, their confidence, and their level of commitment to the coaching process to make a determination as to which style will work most effectively with them. So in the case that we're talking about, and when we need to coach, we need to coach when people start a new role, for example, or they're changing their role. Perhaps there's been a redefinition, for example, of their role in the organization. Or if they're seeking to improve performance, as we are in this case with Lee, and which we will look at in more depth in just a moment. Or developing talent for future roles, and planning their career on the long term, for example. And we might be looking at somebody who is a high potential employee. Or dealing with stress, and people have a great deal of stress on them today, as we know, and helping them to remove some of that stress, for example, by redefining their role, for example, or clarifying their role, or helping them to look at some other tools that might be of benefit to them in reducing stress, such as progressive relaxation, exercise, and the like. And then lastly, in achieving work-life balance, for example. So continuing with our coaching cycle, assessing and feedback, we look at baseline performance. That's our assessment. Focus on the job expectations and their current performance. We determine the gap, as we have with the case of Lee. We consider why it might be occurring, and we keep examples of positive and negative behavior. We use what are called behavioral examples. So, for example, Lee turned in 3 reports 3 days late on 3 different occasions. That's what the person did. That's what Lee did. That's what we observed, and we're focusing upon very specific examples. Now, we contrast that with the notion of Lee having, in quotes, an attitude. When you say someone has an attitude, you're really making a distinction, and you're drawing an interpretation based upon what you have observed in terms of specific examples. And if you try to address attitude, for example, it's a very difficult thing to do. But if you focus upon behavioral examples, if you focus upon what they said or what they did, that's something that they can understand, and it is something that they can change. It's changeable. That's the key. And oftentimes we make the mistake of trying to deal with attitude, and attitude is simply a compilation of different examples. It's an interpretation. It's a judgment. So we want to avoid dealing with attitude and focus on behavior, what the person said or what the person did. So in feedback, it needs to be relevant. It needs to connect with what's important in their jobs. And it needs to be provided close to the time that it occurs. Now, we find, for example, in our case here, that it didn't occur close to the time that the behavior actually occurred. We find, for example, that the supervisor in this case should have given feedback a couple of months ago, before the merit increase was awarded and before this problem became more difficult to deal with than it was originally. And that's typically what happens. Small problems get larger and larger and larger. So the sooner we address them, the better off we're going to be and the individual will be. So we want to relate it to something that they can affect. They can change their behavior. And it really becomes a call to action. So first step typically is to go back and review, did I define the job clearly with the individual? Their job responsibilities and their competencies. Did I define the expectations and objectives? Did we discuss employees' expectations? And did we get commitment? Now, one of the reasons why it's so important to define job expectations periodically is jobs change. They grow, they're dynamic, and they change from year to year. And so it's helpful to periodically review how the individual is performing in relationship to the expectations. Have the expectations changed from one year to the next? And typically we find your job changes from year to year. So it's periodically advisable to sit down and spend some time discussing what the expectations are at the present time. And that alleviates many of the difficulties, for example, in terms of performance. In giving constructive feedback, in our case, we know, for example, that the purpose of the feedback is twofold. One is, Marty should have given the feedback previously, and he needs to indicate that when he's giving the feedback to Lee. So he may, for example, start off in the example that we're using here and indicate there's something that came up that I should have addressed some time ago, and I didn't. We need to address it at this point. And the purpose for the feedback is to help the individual improve their performance. And then you've got the facts, and the facts are that your reports were turned in 3 times, 3 days late, and incomplete. In addition, there was information that you did not share with me regarding a change, for example, in terms of some of our equipment. This is of concern to me because it influences and impacts our performance and productivity as well as it does others. And here, the supervisor has to stop and give them a chance to respond. Now, this is a very difficult point because our natural inclination as a manager or as a supervisor is to solve problems. And so what we naturally will start to do is to give them a specific way of solving the problem, as opposed to finding out what the real cause of the performance issue or problem was. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to accept any idea that they come up with. Rather, we listen intently to what they say, and we want to ask the question of them, what are you going to do differently? And then, if necessary, offer additional ideas. And then once we have come to agreement in terms of what's going to be done, we want the individual to summarize what action they are going to take, and we want to set a follow-up date. And the follow-up date is so important because if we don't follow up, action won't be taken. So it's generally advisable to set up a follow-up date within a week or 2 weeks at the outside with a specific time and a specific date specified. Now, in giving feedback, we know that we're going to run into that defensive behavior that we were describing before. And that's why it's so important before having a discussion of this nature, it's essential that you have the facts. And that means doing your homework before you go in to have this kind of a discussion. Otherwise, people are going to get very defensive and it could get very nasty, so to speak. So you need to have your facts. If you have your facts, it helps to reduce the defensiveness on the person's part, particularly when you're very specific. So let's say, for example, that someone gets angry when you provide that information to them. Well, there are a couple of ways that we can handle this. And one, I would caution you, if somebody is getting angry, it's generally advisable not to get angry, obviously, in return. Second, if they're getting angry, it might be a good time to conclude your meeting. And you might indicate to them, well, I don't want to say anything that I'm going to regret, and I don't want you to say anything you're going to regret. So perhaps it's time for us to call off our meeting for today, and we'll meet at another time. If someone's getting angry, don't take it in stride. We've seen too many examples in the workplace in recent years where people have done some very strange kinds of things when they've gotten angry. And we don't want that to happen. If they get fearful, for example, then perhaps you may need to reassure them that while it is a performance problem, it's not something that is beyond their ability to be able to handle. If, on the other hand, they sit there and they don't say anything at all, then we need to be very assertive and indicate the importance of the problem and why it's an important problem, and insist that they take some time to think about it. And we might encourage them to take 24 hours and think about how they're going to handle that particular problem. Oftentimes, the manager takes the responsibility for the problem on his or her shoulders without realizing that it's the individual's, it's the employee's problem to deal with. And they need to take on the responsibility for solving the problem. And the more that we do this, the more that we're treating people basically as adults. Now, if somebody indicates, for example, in response to the feedback that, well, somebody else prevented me from getting the information that I needed to get to you, it's still their responsibility to let the manager know, or the supervisor, that they're unable to get the information because of that reason, rather than just dropping the ball and not getting the information along to the individual involved. In some cases, people have ended up crying, for example, when they've received feedback because they've been so shocked or surprised by it. And generally, one of the approaches to dealing with that might be to give them a few minutes to compose themselves, step out of your office, and then come back perhaps after getting a cup of coffee, and then re-engaging them on that performance issue. So there are a variety of different approaches, but one of the key things that comes out time after time for effective feedback is having the facts. That's the critical piece. Next step, building a plan. What is the employee going to do as a result of the feedback? And what might you do to help support them? Well, one of the ways you might support them is by encouraging them on the one hand. Second way might be to monitor their performance and see how they do. So you have them rehearse and practice before enacting their performance plan. So you might have them lay out the plan, for example, and have them walk you through how they are going to do it, how they are going to perform. Feedback on the performance is an essential piece. So they build the plan, they rehearse with you in private. They get specific feedback on how you see the plan, and then they get a chance to practice it correctly and get feedback again. And then you plan for the actual application. When, where, with whom, how, and obtaining feedback. Rehearsal is essential, but the rehearsal needs to be specific and it needs to be effective. So it has to have some feedback to the rehearsal. Next, we launch. And in the launching stage, basically what we're suggesting is that you need to either observe how they perform or perhaps develop some checklists, for example, that they could use or that somebody else in their environment could use. Or you're going to give them feedback, or they're going to follow an action plan, or they're going to see how they do it on the job, but you need results. So let's take an example, and let's say, for example, that the person has had some problems with their presentation skills. Well, you could observe how they actually handle the presentation skill after they've had their rehearsal and their practice. Or you could develop a checklist, for example, of key behaviors that you want to see them demonstrate in a presentation, such as eye contact, or their stance, or whether they use gestures, or how they handle questions, for example. And you could give that to someone, for example, in the audience to give them some feedback. Or we could set up an action plan. And they're going to go in and make a presentation, for example, to a particular group. Maybe it's at a staff meeting. And we have people on the staff provide the feedback. And that's part of their action plan. Or perhaps they go out on a sales call. And someone goes along with them, whether it's the coach or whether it's a supervisor or manager, and observes how they do on the sales call. And here we have the actual transfer of the skill to the job. And lastly, looking at the results. What has the person been able to achieve? And we can get some feedback also from them. Then we want to evaluate. Now in the evaluation, what we're really looking at is how well has the person performed? To what level have they performed? How well have they done with that particular skill? So after returning from training program, what happens? We know, for example, right after a program, the skill will start to decline unless there is reinforcement. That happens immediately after the program. After returning from a training program, Within a week to 10 days, the person will lose the skill unless it's reinforced or used extensively. It takes approximately 30 days of continuous use for the skill to develop and maintain itself. After the 30 days, it is typically a new skill, for example, and the person will tend to utilize it in that fashion. But it takes a 30-day period, typically, to reinforce that skill and get it to the level that's acceptable. So we need to evaluate afterwards, and we need to provide some feedback. What we are trying to do basically is to change behavior. We're trying to get the person and help the person to behave differently than the way they behaved originally. So our focus is upon behavioral change. We're not trying to change attitudes. We're not trying to change personalities. Simply behavior. And behavior is something that involves what they say and what they do. So people tend to work best when they know what's expected, when things have been clearly defined for them, particularly in terms of job expectations. When they can compare how they have done against those expectations, and lastly, when they are rewarded for doing what was expected. In other words, when they receive feedback, positive feedback. Now, we oftentimes today hear people say, well, I'd like a lot of authority, and I'm willing to accept responsibility, but I'm not sure that I want to take on accountability. And accountability basically is answerability for the responses or what you've been able to accomplish. And that's both positive and negative. If the person has performed well, we need to reinforce that with positive feedback. If the person, on the other hand, has not performed well, they also need to hear that in terms of constructive feedback. So in both cases, they're answerable for the results. That's what accountability is, and something that we need to emphasize with our employees. So 80% of performance problems, which we've really been focusing upon here, are due to misunderstanding of the expectations. They don't know what's expected of them. They haven't received feedback, or there's been a lack of reinforcement. Now, people don't change typically dramatically. They tend to change in small steps. So as soon as we see a person developing that skill, for example, or improving their performance, we need to be ready to step in and provide them with positive feedback. In giving positive feedback, we need to describe the performance that's being recognized. What are they doing that we're recognizing? And that means being specific. For example, if I simply say, well, you're doing a great job, that really doesn't tell the individual very much. On the other hand, if I say to them, that 2-column analysis that you did for us helped us to sell this program to senior management, and they're all on board now, and that's why I'm recognizing you. So you explain what the benefits are to the employee and to the unit. And then you ask for their comments so that you get them involved interactively in the process. And then express your confidence to them to maintain the performance. Now, that's really the key to giving positive feedback. Not to be cynical, but we're not giving positive feedback out of the goodness of our hearts. We want to see more of that performance, basically, and that's one of the reasons why we're recognizing the performance very specifically and encouraging the person to continue with that level of performance. And then finally, we want to thank the employee for their performance and what it has meant to them, to us, and to their unit. So in doing coaching, for example, the approach that you might use is to assess and feedback and be specific in terms of the feedback. It's a call to action on the part of the employee. You help them to build a plan. In other words, how are they going to approach the issue that they need to deal with? You help them to launch it, and that means providing some time for rehearsal, some practice beforehand. And then lastly, evaluating how they did and reinforcing that with positive reinforcement, giving them positive feedback when they are successful to ensure that they continue with that specific skill and that it doesn't drop off. And that's really an area where many managers and supervisors make a mistake. Someone comes back from a training program, for example, and there's no feedback. There's no discussion of what happened during the course of the training program. And as a result, we're missing a great opportunity, for example, for that individual to be reinforced and to strengthen the skill that they have acquired at the training program. So that concludes our discussion today. Very open to any questions that you might have. Julie?
Thank you, Paul. I think that was a great presentation. And please, if anybody has any questions, please send them on in. I do have a question, Paul. Do you recommend that you have somebody else in the room with you when you're giving feedback? Or is it okay to be one-on-one?
Typically, I would recommend doing it on a one-on-one basis. The only time that I would recommend having somebody else in there is if it was a particularly difficult problem, for example, or you were anticipating a very negative reaction to receiving the feedback, where someone, for example, might get angry, and you would be, the individual would be in the best position to know how that person might respond. If they are going to get angry, it would be a good idea to have somebody from human resources or from security, or to have the manager's manager attend that feedback session.
Okay, great. Do you have any thoughts on how best to handle the he said, she said situations with employees where it's difficult to get the facts of the situation?
When it's difficult to get the facts?
Yes, the facts are hard to find.
It's very important to continue and be persistent, because oftentimes people will try to dissuade you. They may say, for example, it's not important, or they may, for example, say it's somebody else's responsibility, and you really have to be persistent. And that's why having the factual information as much as you can really helps contribute a great deal to giving any kind of feedback, basically. But you've got to ask a lot of questions, and you've got to be willing to probe. Persistence, okay. Persistence, persistence. Okay.
You mentioned attitude as more difficult to address, that facts are better. What if the main issue is a person's attitude, their interaction with coworkers, or even client feedback?
Well, when we talk about attitude, what we've really done is we've said that this person perhaps has been very uncooperative. So, for example, when we're looking for additional assistance, or when we're looking for volunteers to contribute, or when we're looking for people to work effectively as a team, this is the person who denies all of those kinds of situations. And what we've done is we've taken that behavior and we've extrapolated from that to say that the person has an attitude. So what we need to do is to identify what are those specific behaviors and focus on those as opposed to the attitude.
Right,
that makes sense. Clarify it?
Mm-hmm. How do you know if it's time to just let someone go?
I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty hearing you, Julie.
Oh,
can you speak up a little bit, please?
Yes. How do you know when it's time to just let someone go?
Well, that's kind of a difficult question to answer in a way. Much depends upon the kind of policy, for example, that your organization has, and certainly you have to perform in relationship to that policy. For example, Some organizations are very, very stringent in terms of the requirements before they'll terminate somebody. And they have a very strict policy regarding probation and any kind of termination discussion. So I think, number one, you have to check what the policy is. I think, secondly, one of the problems that we often encounter in dealing with performance problems is we almost feel guilty in dealing with some of these performance issues because we feel that we haven't done enough on it. I think, from my point of view, I think it's very important to treat people as adults. And if the person has not been performing for some time consistently, then I think you've got to entertain that notion of perhaps letting them go. I cannot give you a specific timeline. That depends upon your company, your organization, in terms of the steps that you need to go through before letting someone go. But I would check with my human resources department and obviously inform management before taking any kind of action in either direction.
And this might lead to the next question. In your experience, should the plan and action steps be written down if you have everything in writing? Does that help?
Yes, I believe it's very critical to put the things in writing because oftentimes people will come back to you and say, oh, I didn't agree to that, or that's not my understanding of it. But if you do have something in writing, for example, in terms of an action plan, then both of you have something to work from in terms of assessing and monitoring the performance from that point. So I think that's a very critical piece, basically, in terms of any kind of coaching, so that we both understand and we both have a similar perception in terms of what's supposed to be accomplished.
Okay. Do you, in your opinion, do you think it's a good idea to approach peers when you know that they are not meeting expectations but you want to help them?
I think that's a very difficult thing to do, and I think it really revolves around the kind of relationship that you have with the peer. And I think the problem with it basically is that it can be seen as interference. Now, if you have a good relationship with the individual and you know them very well and they tend to be very open and honest and frank with you, then perhaps you can do that kind of coaching. However, that's a very small percentage of the time, I would suggest to you. Excuse me.
Okay. I have a question about if you can recommend any websites or other resources that the group here can use to continue learning about this subject.
Well, I think one of the, excuse me, there are a couple of books out, for example, I think that are very helpful. I think for the relatively inexperienced manager or supervisor, in other words, a new manager or supervisor, probably one of the best books that's out there is Why Employees Don't Do What They're Supposed to Do. And it was written by Ferdinand Fournier, F-O-U-R-N-I-E-S, Ferdinand Fournier. And this has been really a Bible, so to speak, for quite a number of years. It's been a very effective approach to dealing with these kinds of performance issues. Another book that's very helpful on dealing with these kinds of performance issues, there's a book out called Evidence-Based Coaching. And this is for someone who has had a fair amount of experience, for example, in management and leadership. And it's written by Diane Stober, S-T-O-B-E-R. That's another very helpful one. A third book that I would recommend is called Situational Leadership, and that's by Paul Hersey. And it focuses upon different leadership styles, for example, and employing those leadership styles in improving people's performance and also in leading people. And I think that's a very helpful book. So I would recommend those, any one of those three, depending upon the level of depth, for example, that one wants to get into. The first one by Fournier tends to be at a relatively low level. excuse me, I'm very sorry, it tends to be at a lower level. The one by Hersey is in the mid-level, and the one by Stober is a very advanced kind of book for people who have done a fair amount of coaching over the years.
Okay, that's fantastic. I think everybody, could you spell the last name of the authors again? The first one was?
Yes, the first one was Ferdinand Fournier, F-O-U-R-N-I-E-S.
Okay.
The second one, which was that very advanced book on evidence-based coaching, is Diane Stober, S-T-O-B-E-R. And the third book, which is entitled Situational Leadership, was by Paul Hersey, H-E-R-S-E-Y.
Great. I think everybody hopefully got that. Okay, I think we have answered all questions. You've covered a lot of information. Was there anything else you wanted to add, Paul?
No, I think the big thing dealing with coaching, basically, particularly if you're trying to improve somebody's performance, is persistence, 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 and helping them to understand what the facts are and being specific with it. I think that's the critical piece, plus trying to address it as soon as possible.
I was going to say that the timeliness seems to be very important as well.
Yep.
All right,
Thank
fantastic.
you very much, Julie. I enjoyed doing this, and if people have any further questions, they may contact me directly at the university.
Well, great. I want everyone to know that we will have this recorded webinar on our website, again, at fairfield.edu/alumni career, and you click on webinar series and you can find all of our past webinars listed there with all of the recordings. So I encourage you to go check that out. And Paul has also offered his slides, and so they will be available upon request as well. So if there's nothing further, I would like to thank you all for coming today, and I'd like to invite you all to come to our next in our series of alumni career webinars on December 18th, when we'll have alumna Claire St. Louis, class of 1983. She'll be presenting on building a talent pipeline, how to stop planning for succession and start managing it. So again, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Paul. We really appreciate the time that you gave us today.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you all for coming.
All right, happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving.